This week on Quadriga, same-sex marriage, a human right? Ireland is set to become the first country in the world to allow same-sex marriage via a referendum on the topic. 62% of the people who voted were in favor of legalizing it. The historic decision has increased pressure on other governments to follow the Irish example, but conservative politicians and the Catholic Church remain staunchly against full equality for gay and lesbian couples. The Vatican called the outcome of the Irish vote a defeat for humanity. Coming to you from Berlin, Quadriga, the international debate. Your host this week, Peter Craven.
Yes, hello, and a very warm welcome indeed to this latest edition of Quadriga, coming to you from the heart of Berlin. And the question we're addressing today is same-sex marriage a human right? Question mark, perhaps a big question mark. I'm sure it's going to be a fascinating conversation. I've got three excellent commentators with me in the studio to discuss all this, and I'd like to introduce them to you without any further ado. Let me begin with Andreas Clute. He is the Berlin bureau chief and Germany correspondent for the Economist magazine, and what he says is this: in the West, opinion is shifting in favour of gay marriage, but we also see a worrying trend away from gay rights in Eastern Europe, Africa and the Middle East. That's important, we'll be talking about that. We've also got here today our own John Berwick, DW's religious affairs correspondent, who argues that there's no place for theology in civil marriage law. That's an interesting position. I look forward to debating that too. And last but not least, the Anglo-German writer and journalist Alan Posener, who's a regular commentator for the Berlin-based newspaper Die Welt. Bravo Ireland, says Alan, and the rest of the world may follow. OK, Alan, I've got to begin with you after that, after that resounding bravo, yeah? You clearly welcome the outcome of the referendum in Ireland. Why?
Well, you know, Ireland was the most Catholic country in Europe until, a couple of decades ago. And even to the point that the government consulted with the Vatican before, passing laws, introducing laws into Parliament, so let alone the fact the Catholic Church ran the education system and so on. So if that country can turn so quickly into a country which is liberal and welcoming towards rights for everyone, which is what this is about, then somehow that gives me hope that, the benighted rest of the world, let's face it, I mean, the Islamic world, Africa, even Christian Africa, Eastern Europe, can follow suit too. So yes, bravo Ireland.
You must have been very surprised about the outcome coming from Ireland, because, as you're pointing out, Ireland is a fundamentally conservative society still, lagging behind the rest of Europe on abortion, for example.
For instance, on that, they may have a point there, but, yes, and I would have thought that with the economic crisis hitting Ireland so hard, they might have sort of reverted to conservatism and sort of said, liberalism doesn't work for us. But no, on this case, they've shuffled off the mortal coil of Catholic dominance and decided that they want to go for a liberal society. And I said, I'm all for it, fine,
OK, Andreas is nodding. Andreas Clute, I know you too welcome the outcome of the referendum in Ireland, but you have also, we heard it in the introduction that I gave, you've sounded a note of caution, saying that the pendulum is swinging the other way in many other parts of the world. Tell us more.
Well, what you see is if you look a map, in fact, there have been plenty of maps made this week about this, including in the Economist, of gay rights and gay marriage rights, that what you see is essentially the West changing color year by year in one direction toward gay rights, and the East running through roughly the old Iron Curtain in the other direction, going, if anything, backwards. And then as you zoom out and you look at Africa and the other places, so if you're looking at the Russia of Vladimir Putin, every year that Vladimir Putin is in power is a slightly worse year to be homosexual in that country. It's interesting that even within Europe, you see very much historically interesting but clearly divided geographies of this. For instance, you mentioned Ireland is the most Catholic country in this remarkable turnaround. It's interesting that a lot of the other formerly or still very Catholic countries, Portugal, Spain, are among those. Of course, Scandinavia is going to do that. They have done it. Of course, the Netherlands will do it. But you get to France, Spain, Portugal, they're there, and now Ireland is there as well. So you have essentially the entire west of this continent getting very much more liberal very fast, especially the young people. Then around the middle, where we are now, including Germany, also going in that direction, but not quite sure. And then you get to Eastern Europe, on the other side of the former Iron Curtain, and then it drops off with every mile, it seems, that you go east.
And Andreas, just you mentioned that you work for the Economist magazine. Just give us an idea of your publication's position on same-sex marriage.
Yes, I think we were for gay marriage long before it was fashionable, shall we say, among right-thinking enlightened media. That's an
interesting word, fashionable.
I think it has become that, but we, for decades, in fact, the first, I think, cover leader, another cover story, when we said, let them wed, I think it was called, was in exactly 20 years ago. Mm-hmm. And at that time, it was still very much non-obvious. I mean, at the time that we were all born, it was hard to imagine that marriage was not among men and women just because the question hadn't been asked. Yeah. We came out of our, we're 170 years old. Obviously, our founding fathers probably also would have been surprised to debate this particular point. But we've always had this philosophy of liberalism, which is about individual liberty and freedom. And just coming from that, and it's not only left brain, but also right brain, we said it makes no sense. And I think we always had this intuition that gay marriage or being against gay marriage is not terribly unlike being against interracial marriage a few decades before that, which was once the social consensus in many, especially southern states in America, for instance. There were laws against that. Now, we couldn't even imagine holding such a position, but they did in our, not long ago. And I think even then we thought this is going the same way, and it is going that way, at least in the West, as we saw this week.
OK, I'd like to pick up on that point and bring in John Berwick. John, you've got this guy here saying bravo about what happened in Ireland, and this guy here saying
bravo.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, but saying at the same, he's also saying beware. Yeah, because what is happening in Ireland is, let's admit it, atypical for the global picture. Where's your position on it all?
Well, in Ireland itself, obviously, and in the Western European countries you talked about, states of the United States, this is obviously a big advance for people living in same-sex unions, because, of course, it is a sign of acceptance by society, which is far more than simply being tolerated, of course. That is something that I too would welcome. I think that a kind of benchmark of civilization is the way a society treats its minorities. And minorities, whether you are a Jew or a refugee or a gay man or lesbian woman, you want to be accepted, not simply tolerated. Somebody in this group wouldn't say, I tolerate Jews, I mean, it would be a scandalous remark. I would find that a remark about gay men, for example, I tolerate homosexuality, I find also actually a rather offensive remark. Better than intolerance, though. But I think, though, I'd like to broaden this a little bit, because I see it a little bit broader than this. I think this is really the vote in Ireland, and what we've seen, this development in Western Europe, is far more important than simply a gain on the part of the gay community. This is a major step forward in the development of Western civilization. And it's about the real people who gain in this are the women in our society. Because if you think about it, those people who went to vote in Ireland, for example, 2/3 of the population voting approximately, for regarding same-sex unions as being intrinsically not really different from their own marriages. Mm-hmm. They were taking a really extremely untraditional view, a very anti-patriarchal view of marriage. And that seems to me to be the real significance, that the role of women in society then becomes, and the role of women in a marriage, we're talking about not gays, lesbians being admitted to traditional marriage, we're talking about a whole new definition of marriage. which is based upon mutual respect, caring for two people, two people caring for each other, taking responsibility and so on, and that being recognized as being the core of marriage. When you consider, it wasn't so long ago, the people went to get married and the woman promised obedience to her husband, and everybody thought that was quite normal. My parents did. That is, of course, is pretty unthinkable now.
You're right, and on the one hand, but on the other hand, I would submit that actually it's a very old idea of marriage. It actually goes back to the beginnings of Christianity. Because, you know, when Jesus Christ says to the Pharisees, you can't divorce your wife, because you can't discard her like a thing when she's no longer good to you, good for you reproductively or sexually or whatever. So you have to stay with her no matter what. And when he says you're not even allowed to look at another woman because doing that would be committing adultery in your heart. I think this is where this idea of marriage actually starts. And I'm not saying, of course, that Christians haven't, betrayed this idea in the course of 2,000 years, but there is that sort of romantic idea that you stay with one person, you commit to one person totally, sexually and in every other way, for the rest of your life, which I think leads to this. And I think it's important to stress that this is actually has a long tradition in Western society.
I would disagree that it has a long tradition, unfortunately, but perhaps you don't really mean that. It is, I would agree with you also that exegetically in the Christian scriptures that one of the very provocative things about this figure Jesus of Nazareth is that he appears to have been very much against a patriarchal society. The role that women play in the Gospels is really quite extraordinary, as feminist theologians nowadays like to point out to us. The fact that Mary Magdalene was called in the very early church the Apostolorum, the apostle of the apostles, the role, she was the first person who saw the risen Christ. It was a woman, not a man. She went and then told Peter to come and look, and so on. But I think, if I may, even if I am a religious affairs correspondent, I think that it's very useful in this discussion to separate the theological aspects, Christian theological or Muslim theological, Jewish or whatever, from the aspects of a secular society. What we have is something that is very precious to me. It was, incidentally, also, it is presumably still, to the former Pope Benedict in Freiburg here in Germany. He made a very memorable speech on this subject and shocked, I think, quite a lot of Catholic bishops, in which he said that secularization has always been viewed by the Church as a loss of power and therefore something disastrous. In retrospect, it was something very positive for the Church. And I think I strongly believe that myself, although I am a practicing Catholic, and my faith is probably the most important thing in my life. But I'm deeply grateful for the fact that I live in a secular society where these kinds of decisions about what constitutes a marriage, what is legal in society, is not based, as in, for example, in strict Muslim societies, on religious law.
Well, I wonder to what extent the position against gay marriage is actually still religious. In some places, of course, it is. To some extent, it probably is just homophobia. To some extent, it's just a tradition without necessarily invoking religious tradition. Because I'm thinking, I mean, certainly that trend that any secularization of society and its institutions, including marriage, towards secularization is a good one. I'm thinking, for instance, in America, it was part of the Mormon tradition to have polygamy. I always thought of those people who invoke tradition per se as a reason against gay marriage, if they would also apply that to these kinds of traditions. In other words, if they cherry pick. But with all sorts of religions in pluralistic societies, which is essentially what these Western societies are, we've had to separate the theocratic traditions from the secular institutions. For example, Mormons, now example, Catholicism and Islam and so forth.
Okay, absolutely fascinating stuff. I'd like to just move away from the church just for an instance and come back to the story in Ireland and bring that story to Germany. Because here's an example. The Süddeutsche newspaper this week, influential newspaper here in Germany, came out and said, Ireland is possible in Germany if it only dared. What's your take on that, Andreas?
Of course it's possible. It's overdue. I think it really has nothing. I mean, Germany is sort of half Catholic, half Protestant since the 30 Years' War, since Luther. It has nothing to do with that. It would be law if it weren't for a tactical political dilemma that the Chancellor, Angela Merkel, finds herself in this country. In that, I think, first of all, both opposition parties in Parliament are for gay marriage, and the coalition partner, the junior partner, the Social Democrats, are also for gay marriage. The holdout is the Christian Democrats of Angela Merkel and the Bavarian sister party, the CSU. Though not Angela Merkel personally, she is probably, there was a famous answer during the last election campaign that she gave when she had to explain why she's not for full marriage. And she couldn't quite explain it. She didn't really want to. She wanted to move on, and it became sort of replayed. It was often, she herself, one has to understand, she's been criticized a lot for moving her party left over her 10 years now of being in government, and maybe left too fast for some in the party, so much so that some people blame that leftward move, I'm not speaking about gays necessarily, generally, for the emergence of the alternative for Germany. So she thinks this, I'm sure that this will happen. And some little tweaks were made this week already in terms of civil unions.
But is tweak good enough? I mean, you've mentioned the opposition. One opposition spokeswoman came out from the Greens, came out after what happened in Ireland and said Germany is a backward country. That sounds more, it sounds as though there's more to the problem there than the political technicalities that you're, talking about there.
You can chime in. Germany is not a backward country, and it will catch up, and I guarantee you, probably not during this legislative period, but after 2017, after the next election, it will. You have to, Angela Merkel is the queen in the Euro crisis, or in topic after topic of sensing what the population is ready for, what her party is ready for, and bringing them along. Or you could say leading from the back. That's the criticism. When they're ready, she will suddenly lead them to where they already are. and the party is going there, the Christian Democrats, but they're not quite there yet.
I'd like to get Alan to just tell us a little bit more about that. So, because for people outside Germany, this is very important. That in many countries, there's sort of the left and the right. There's the conservatives. In Germany, the Conservatives, Angela Merkel's Conservatives, are the CDU. The C there is not for conservative, but for Christian. That's important.
Well, it is important because they are, they are mixing with, by saying that they're Christian, they're mixing politics and religion. It's actually a bad thing. They should, like the British Conservatives, simply call themselves Conservatives, because calling yourself a Christian Democratic Party lays yourself open to a certain faction within the party of saying you can't do this because it's, because it's not Christian or it doesn't agree with Christian values or whatever. So
I don't agree at all. I'm sorry. But surely the name Christian Democratic Union nowadays is simply a name. It has an historical legacy. I mean, nobody in the party itself, no official within the party, would claim that it is a Christian party.
Well, they do. You could not say this of Bavaria.
Oh, I think you can. I mean, I lived in Bavaria for a while, and there's a general acknowledgement that there is an historical reason for this, but the party has opened its membership to non-Christians for a very long time, and that, by definition, therefore, it is not an essential part of the... Of course, it looks back upon a certain tradition, as conservative parties always do, look back to Christian values and so on, but they are values that have become Western values. They're not specifically Christian values. I challenge you to name one.
At the risk of drifting away from our topic, which is gay marriage, but I just want to confirm this, and with a bit of perspective, given that a lot of your viewers are outside of Germany, the history of that letter C, the Christian, for both the Bavarian and the rest of Germany, those parties, actually it comes from the Weimar Republic, when there were separate Catholic and Protestant parties, and there were the cultural fault lines in Germany used to always run since the 30 Years' War between Protestants and Catholics. So when after World War II they refounded the parties, the Union part as well as the Christian party said, no, let's stop with that fighting among Protestants and Catholics. We're just all a Christian union now. So it was more an emphasis of let's stop fighting rather than to emphasize, as for instance in America, which is on paper more secular than Germany, the evangelicals, let's say, their influence in the Republican Party. The Christians or the Catholics, for instance, in the CDU have nowhere near that influence. In fact, the CDU has it's a big tent from quite left to some market liberals, some pro-business people, and yes, some Catholics who might be all over the place. But I think actually there is nothing religious or theocratic holding the party back.
No, I agree.
Okay. That was very interesting. It was important to understand that. I would like to get back to the big overarching question: is same-sex marriage a human right? I've got a quote from Christina Luders, the German government's anti-discrimination advisor. She says, "The right to marry is," most emphatic she is, "the right to marry is for gays and lesbians a human right." Is it a human right without any ifs and buts at all?
I think you have to define the word marriage. This is really the crux of what is happening. This is the real, in my view, the real social and political significance, civilizational significance. That this vote in Ireland and in these other Western European countries we've talked about is a redefinition of marriage, a very radical redefinition of marriage, moving away from a view long in the Christian tradition, for example, that the purpose of marriage was the main primary function of marriage was to procreate, to have children. The Catholic Church itself, in the middle of the 20th century with the Second Vatican Council, shifted that perspective and no longer placed that as the primary one, but placed love and the mutual commitment as being the defining aspect of marriage. If it were not so, and this is the background to that insight that the Church had, if it were not so, then one would be forced to say logically that couples who were unable to have children had some kind of inferior marriage, and nobody in their right mind would say that, at least not in our society, I don't think. And so I think it's very misleading, actually, to look at this specifically as a sexual moral question. I think although it's often discussed in that way, I think I really, if I could, I'd like to try to shift our discussion a little bit to this question, my contention at least, that what we're looking at is a development away, in the past 100 years, in Western Europe in particular, away from a patriarchal society in which the white heterosexual male has had a dominant role. This cannot be seen, this development, in my view, apart from the whole development of feminism in Western society, the new role of women in society. And what this makes this vote possible is heterosexuals, forming obviously the vast majority, heterosexuals gaining a new understanding of what marriage itself is about. So that to make a statement like the one that you just quoted there, to say marriage is a human right, one needs to know what one's talking about. The old patriarchal idea of marriage certainly is not a human right, it's a violation of human rights.
Whether or not it's a human right, it's certainly a consensus, as you've been pointing out, in Western Europe. Given that consensus, what do people in Western Europe, what do you folks say to people, or what would you say to people among our viewers in the areas of the world that you've been talking about, Africa or the Middle East or wherever, who say this is not part of our tradition, this is not part of our lifestyle, this is not the way we do things? What would you say to such people?
Well, I'd say, first of all, that you probably don't know what sexual orientation your neighbour has. It may be part of your culture to not look at what's happening. It may be part of your culture to discriminate against gays. It may be part of your culture, as the regime in Iran likes to pretend, to hang people on cranes for being gay. But that doesn't change the fact that every member, that firstly there are gays in your culture, that you're not admitting it. There is a certain percentage of gay people in every culture. We know this for a scientific fact. And secondly, that if your culture isn't accepting of these people, not merely tolerating them, isn't welcoming towards these people, then your culture has a deficit. And I'm very sorry. I'm not, I'm not saying that we're better than everyone else in every respect. There's lots of respects. I think our culture has a deficit, but in this respect, learn from us, learn from Ireland.
So what you're saying is gay rights are universal human
definitely.
rights, and same-sex marriage is a universal human right too.
Absolutely. If we understand the marriage as John said it, as I don't think gays should have a right to have a sort of harem of other gays who they then oppress. I mean, that's not what we're talking about here.
No, that is the key issue, I think, also with the moral aspect of this, that I think that in our understanding of a secular society, and why I would argue to separate the theological question, I should say in this regard, I am myself a gay man. And I am a devout Roman Catholic. My faith, as I said, is probably the most important thing in my life. This is something that I have wrestled with, and that's why I mention it here, for most of my life. But this is an area for which the state has no business to legislate, provided something occurs in the moral sphere that does not directly harm anybody outside of consenting adults. It is simply not, in my political understanding, it is not the business of the state to interfere. That is a private matter, and that is why I feel uncomfortable about judging this simply or discussing it even on the moral issue, because I feel this is it's important on the moral issues, but they are an entirely different discussion.
As to your question about how you were, I think, putting on our table, or our metaphorical table, how would we try to persuade viewers of this program in Africa, in the Middle East?
Sorry to interrupt, but the problem is that very often we sound as though we know what is right, and
exactly.
that they are wrong, and that's a problem.
Exactly, and therefore I would be I would be empathetic with them as much as I disagree with them, and first of all say, look, I realize we in the West, until very recently, held the same view as you. We've just gone a bit further, and I think the rest of the world, or parts of it, those that are open, and those people viewing this program, I think, are by nature cosmopolitans wherever they live, will come the same way. And I would trust a lot, if they're not interested in the conversation, in just time to do the work, because you now have, for instance, in America, I used to cover California, where there was a referendum against gay marriage, which the courts overruled, and in America is tearing itself apart over this. There, as usual, the Supreme Court is this year going to have the final word in this, which is not always the better way, is to do it the Irish way, because then essentially we have a consensus. But what you see over time in these places is the power of example. Many gay couples, maybe many lesbian couples, and the profound sense of normality that you see. A lot of the hysteria in the backlash against gay marriage comes from people constantly predicting the end of the world. And what keeps happening is the polite term in all these conspiracy theories is non-confirmation. It just keeps not ending. And it's fantastically, I mean, we've expanded the number of people who can now have arguments over who last had the car keys. If you want to, I mean, marriage is as much as a curse as a blessing to all these couples. But you see them, and I've personally known lesbian gay couples raising children, adopting children, and doing a fantastic job, and often an infinitely better job than the heterosexual couple, where the man or the woman is off doing God knows what. And as these examples accumulate, and they will, you see, God, it's time to move on to other subjects. And then and this was the same with every expansion of human rights to larger groups in liberal societies, to women voting and so forth. Every time, prediction of the end of the world, delayed by a little bit, let's move on to something else.
OK, thanks very much indeed for that, Andreas. Just 1 second, but I'm going to give us a little bit of a break, because obviously when we're talking about same-sex marriage, the church plays a very central role in all this, in the rights and wrongs of it, if you so will. Let's just watch a short report now on the role of the church, and then we'll talk some more.
The Catholic Church continues to view living in a homosexual relationship as a sin. It says only unions between men and women should be allowed, because only they lead to the transmission of life. But many believers now say that stance is unrealistic, and some members of the clergy agree.
If you look at what happened, particularly with regard to the large number of young people voting, that I believe the Church has to carry out a reality check about its relationship with young people particularly.
Some of his colleagues and many other lay Catholics now hope Pope Francis will reconsider the issue. 2 years ago, he told reporters, "If someone is gay and seeks the Lord with goodwill, who am I to judge?"
Alan Posener, a reality check for the Irish Catholic Church. What does that promise?
Well, I feel a bit uncomfortable here because I'm not a Catholic, and sort of pontificate on what the pontiff ought to say seems to me slightly presumptuous. But I personally don't have a problem with a religious community explaining that something is a sin for their members. So, you know, if Jews aren't allowed to eat pork, well, the answer is, you know, tough for them because it tastes very nice. If Muslims aren't allowed to eat pork, well, too bad. And if I'm sorry about this, but if being gay or practicing a gay life makes you a sinner in the eyes of the church, that's something a Catholic has to work out with his or her priest and not with me. And I'm not going to interfere. And I don't think it really matters to... The point, really, where I take issue with the Catholic Church is when the Pope, for instance, who's been praised in this short snippet, or when his speaker says this has been a disaster for man,
a defeat for humanity.
A defeat for humanity. In other words, a defeat for myself. This referendum in Ireland. I say, look, you keep out. I'm not messing in your business. You know, you do your stuff in your church, but don't mess with the way I see marriage and gay rights and so on. So that's overstepping a line. So I would expect, you know, Catholics. Yeah, I'm not going to interfere with the Catholic Church as long as they leave me alone.
It strikes me, if I may say so, that the Catholic Church is a more extreme version of the Christian Democratic Union here, in that I happen to believe, you've noticed, no statement has come from the pontiff saying this is a defeat for humanity. In fact, the statement on the subject that we have from him is saying, who am I to judge? And I feel in both cases, Angela Merkel and the pontiff, you have essentially tolerant, by nature tolerant people, willing and able to change their minds over time, and just taking I think it's almost probably the luck of your genes, a relaxed personality about this. The backlash or the difficulties in the institutions are really underneath with the Catholics, the Vatican underneath the pontiff, and the parts of the Christian Democratic Union underneath Angela Merkel. But I think that's another reason. It shows you more and more people in both of these institutions, shall we say, Catholic Church and CDU, will follow their leaders in that respect and become relaxed and tolerant.
I'm interested to hear what you have to say here, John. We've got, on the one hand, a defeat for humanity comment coming from the church in Rome, which almost sounds like sort of battening the hatches and digging in.
Well,
on the other hand, just one second, just the contrast, because it has been mentioned, yeah. Yeah. But at the same time, we have had the Pope speaking out benignly about homosexuals in the not-too-distant past. What's going on there?
There is clearly, as there is in Western society generally, on this issue, there is a debate going on. There's a lot of questioning going on in the Roman Catholic Church among theologians and senior clergy. There is no clarity. This is something that people are wrestling with. I would like to give the individual the benefit of the doubt that one is wrestling as honestly as one can to try to come to a view of the truth, even if I don't agree with them. I'm no great admirer of Oliver Cromwell. He did some pretty dreadful things, of course, but something that has stuck in my memory as being something very pertinent. I think it was before the Battle of Dunbar that he sent a message, didn't he, to the opposing army saying, to spare blood, he sent the message saying, I beseech you, think of the possibility that you may be wrong. And that surely is the basis of, in a society, however firm a believer you are, however personally devoted you may be to your faith or to your moral perspectives, philosophical, ideological, whatever they are, that it's a question of human freedom, which is a fundamental concept. Also to the world religions, not only to secular society. It's a fundamental principle of being a human being, to allow other people, to accept other people without necessarily approving of what they do, provided, of course, that they don't harm other members of society non-consensually. That is the huge difference, of course, between something like child abuse, where the state, in my view, has a clear responsibility to legislate and criminalise activity of that kind, and to say that married couples, for example, what they do in their bedrooms is nobody else's affair. That doesn't imply that one necessarily personally, morally approves of what other people do. I think one needs to make that distinction. The Pope is Pope Francis, sorry, the German Franciscus, Pope Francis is very much along those lines. He opposed, personally, as the Archbishop of Buenos Aires, he opposed same-sex unions being made legal there, having the same status as marriage when he was there, I think in good faith. But he is also somebody who has said the church has to be inclusive, has to be accepting, has to be a place where people are welcomed, first of all, before not judged, but welcomed. And that is a different attitude. The quote that we've had here of also that attributed to that church was the Secretary of State who made this, for me, completely incomprehensible remark that it's a defeat for humanity. I think, was it? Pope Francis himself has used that phrase, incidentally, in the past. He's used it, though, only in connection with war. And that's a huge difference, isn't it? Because in war, that's the point. You are standing up for the rights of people who are having their freedom and even their lives taken from them.
OK, I want to stay with the theme of the Catholic Church, because I've got a quote from a spokesman from the Catholic Church here in Germany now, saying the institution of marriage is not just about the partnership between a man and a woman, but also about caring for and taking responsibility for children. We're touching now on that issue, the very sensitive, very central issue to this debate of adoption. Why is it so central? Why is it so sensitive? We've got this report, and then we'll talk again.
An opinion often expressed by opponents of adoption by same-sex couples is that it wouldn't be in the best interests of the child. Kids, they say, need both a father and a mother as role models.
To give a structure to a child, he needs a mother and a father. It cannot be otherwise, and it's nature.
Even today, some specialists claim that a person who grows up with two parents of the same sex might never truly internalize the concept that they were conceived by a man and a woman, and that, some believe, can have a negative influence on identity development.
I'm gay, but I'm against marriage for everybody, not because two people who love one another shouldn't be together, as I myself have a civil union partnership, but in regards to the fundamental question of the child. The fundamental thing for a child is to have a father and a mother like all the other children.
I often wonder if that is so true. I'm not sure that it's not sort of the modern age where the consumerist world almost, where we've designed this world where there's a mother, a father, there's a boy, there's a girl, they're in their medium-sized car driving off on holiday or something like that, yeah? Is that, this man, woman, child relationship?
Well, I'm glad we're coming around to adoption and to children, because in a sense, I think that is the biggest, or maybe the last remaining argument that has not been resolved. But I think this one, as I'm a dad, I've got 3 kids, and I'm very small c conservative on parenting. And that is actually, I'm glad we're therefore discussing it. The discussion should go this way from my, there are plenty of heterosexual couples that should not be allowed to adopt children. There are plenty of biological parents that are not good parents. So when you put the child's interests first, I'm all in favor of that, with separate and additional legislation and social pressure and in every possible way to look at how children can be protected, because many children in heterosexual families are suffering abuse and whatever. But therefore, we have already moved the debate to where it should be, was the individual household, the mother and the father, or the mother and the mother and the father and the father. Because the fact is, I happen to have positive examples in my social circle that you can have the 2 best fathers can be a gay couple. The 2 best lesbian mothers can be a lesbian couple. And so the child's interest must be sacrosanct. But we have to accept, and this is the time to think a little bit like a lawyer, or a constitutional lawyer, or a founding father of the, shall we say, as if we were Alexander Hamilton, James Madison again today, and we had a new constitution. We cannot say, well, marriage between man and women, they get to raise children, the others don't. No, we should say good parents get to raise children. Parents get to raise children, but we must protect the child. If there are bad parents, no matter whether they're heterosexual or homosexual, we probably should intervene.
OK, point well taken. Each of you gentlemen have got a minute on the adoption question. I know it's sensitive, I know it's difficult. Alan.
Well, look, children have been brought up, you know, by sort of a horde of mothers in some so-called primitive societies where there's no such thing as a small nuclear family that we know about. The grandparents of my wife, they were farmers in Bavaria, and all the children were brought up by grandmothers and aunts and so on. Didn't see a man until he sort of came in at the end of the day and yelled at them. So I think, you know, we do have this strange idea as if sort of Mama, Papa and the kiddo is sort of the norm. It's not. For most children in all of the world, it's not. So we can't be made to, it can't be put into law that other people who live differently can't raise children.
John?
Psychologists tell us, of course, Western psychologists, whether they're right or wrong, that children need male and female role models and close relationships to both sexes for a healthy psychological development. That's one of the important aspects of a child's upbringing. There are many others, of course, including being able to provide for the child materially, emotionally, all kinds of things. Adoption agencies, as far as I know, living in the real world and not some kind of ideal world of ideal parents, because there aren't any, weigh up these factors when they give a child to adoption. And they obviously, I think from that point of view, the whole discussion is frankly a kind of spurious discussion, because those checks are in place in Western societies. They look, first of all, is the relationship stable? Are the people psychologically mature? There are all kinds of tests that go on, first of all, to do that. Are they in a financial position to cater for the child materially? Do they have people of both sexes in close friendships and that the children would have as role models? So these questions are looked at, and one, I think, can only, as is presently the case with heterosexual couples, make a decision from case to case.
OK, I can hear the music. I've got to summarise with one final question. Same-sex marriage, is it a human right despite the fact that it hasn't been right down through human history? Yes or no?
Yes, of course.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Redefine marriage, which is what's happening.
I knew he was going to say that. Are we going to get it any time soon? Is Angela Merkel going to jump on board and
yes,
take the Irish path? OK, thanks very much for that. It's been a fascinating discussion. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. If you have, then do come back next week. Until then, bye-bye and tschüss from Quadriga.